Everyone had a chance to eat and enjoyed their meal. We're going to move things along with our final panel of the day, the future of anti-poverty policy. We had two very interesting discussions this morning, and I'm sure this one will pick up right where we left off. The moderator is Mickey Kaus, and I want to thank him for agreeing to do this. Mickey is one of the first people I called when I had the idea for this symposium last year, having read his work back in the 90s. In particular, he's written extensively on these issues, poverty and welfare reform and so forth, and he was extremely helpful in helping me to assemble many of the people you've heard from today. So thank you again, Mickey, and I will turn things over to him to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you. I'm an old leftist from the 60s, and at all the old left meetings, right at the end, somebody would stand up and say, "Where do we go from here? We've built such a fabulous movement." And this is that moment in this meeting, the "Where do we go from here" movement.
Amen.
See, I told Jason not to invite Ron. That was my main advice, and he ignored me. I had very high hopes for the 96 Welfare Act, maybe even grandiose hopes. I wrote, it's likely to point the way to ending the culture of poverty. And I was thinking in Marxist terms, and I'm serious about this. The idea being that how people earn their living, what Marxists call the means of production, determines culture, which is the superstructure resting on the economy. And the economy of ghetto poverty, as Wilson would call it, was welfare. So if you change welfare, everything else would have to change as a result. And we've heard today whether that happened. Some people say yes, some people say not so much. In employment, maybe yes. In marriage, maybe the case is less compelling. But that's the framework that at least I had for the bill, which is and that Bill Clinton had. He said, we're going to change welfare to break the culture of poverty in our ghettos. At one point, he actually said that. He wouldn't say it now, but he said it in I think it was '94 he said it. One thing I want to ask our panel is, are those legitimate expectations, or do we have different, lower, other expectations? And if we should have other goals, what are they? How do we meet them? If those are our goals, what can we do to make TANF and the assorted reforms better to better pursue them? I should add that in the intervening decades, I've also become addicted to Twitter, and I'm unable to express myself in sentences of more than 20 words. But I have some 20-word sentences, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. The first is, if you're going to change the culture of poverty, it's not enough to focus on getting the mainly single women who come into the office work. You also have to look at the effect on the men, which we've discussed a bit. You have to look on the positive possible effect of women being success stories, being an inspiration. And you also have to look at the negative, what Robert Rector would call the deterrent effect of women who never go on welfare and see, well, the woman down the street had to go on welfare and she now has to work. It's much better for me just to go find a job without ever going on welfare, what Jason Turner would call diversion. You have to look at all those things. A lot of times, the studies, mainly the studies done by MDRC, only look at the one thing, have you placed women in jobs? And that's much too narrow. The second thing is there's a lot of discussion on the right about marginal incentives. It's one thing to have a disincentive to somebody who's making $20,000. If he tries to make $30,000, there's a big takeaway rate in the earned income tax credit that's a disincentive. But the major thing you have to do is get people who are not connected to the workforce into the workforce in the first place. And that's, it seems to me, a much tougher thing to incentivize. It's very hard to get somebody off the couch and into an 8-hour day. Trust me, I'm Exhibit A in this. ever since I inherited some money, I haven't worked an 8-hour day for about 5 years. It's a universal human principle. We say one size doesn't fit all. I question that. If I go around the country and look at ghetto poverty, it all looks the same to me. Every ghetto in the country looks basically the same. They're all produced by the same forces. Why should we think one size doesn't fit all? We may not know what the size is, but the idea that there's state variations that have to be taken into account seems like a second-order point. Maybe not. Maybe you disagree. A point Kay made, states have really, my impression of the previous discussion and of the literature is, states have not done what we expected them to do when we passed TANF. For example, it seems to me that W2, the program in Wisconsin that Jason Turner established, was a shining example of a success story. Why haven't more states emulated that? Why have so many just relied on the caseload reduction credit to get over the requirements? And if states have fallen down the job in the past, why do we think they're going to do a better job in the future? So that's it for my Twitter thoughts. We have a very distinguished panel, and the first person I want to introduce, we'll do the same format as the other ones. We'll have some presentations, then 20 minutes among ourselves, and then the audience, is Robert Doar. I gave a talk when he was Welfare Commissioner of New York to his troops, yeah. And I think I failed to inspire them. But you probably know him mainly as the Commissioner of the New York City's Human Resource Administration under Mayor Bloomberg. He's the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies now at AEI. And before the stint for Mayor Bloomberg, he was Commissioner of Social Services for the state of New York. So Robert?
Thank you, Mickey, and I am very pleased to be on a panel with such a distinguished group, and also especially with you. As I remember, you certainly did inspire me a long time ago when you wrote the New Republic article, which I think was called "The Only Thing That Works Is Work." And I was just a young, just out of college, thinking that I wanted to get into this business of changing our welfare programs, and that was very inspiring. I should also say that your visit 25 years later to my office was not quite as inspiring. I acknowledge that, but you gave a good speech, so thank you. I associate myself with some of the remarks earlier that the changes in TANF and welfare reform have made significant changes to, and I would say, the culture of poverty, and that work did go up significantly for people that were most likely to be recipients of TANF. That happened in New York City and happened all across the country, and you could see it. And I also think there's been some leveling off, even reductions, for instance, in teen pregnancy rates. And so I think the extent to which young women and men are thinking a little more wisely about the consequences for themselves and their children of having children before they're ready has changed too. Not as much as I'd like, and it hasn't changed as much as in work as I'd like, but I don't think the problem is TANF. I think the problem is the other programs, SNAP, EITC, Social Security, disability benefits, even the Child Support Enforcement Program, which have not learned the lessons of welfare reform or have forgot them. And some of it's our fault, because what we didn't talk about earlier today was that welfare reform was not only about pushing people into work, it was also about rewarding those who went to work with various forms of work supports, whether it's food stamp benefits or the Earned Income Tax Credit, which made work pay, as President Clinton said. And I thought that was good. And in New York City, we promoted those programs for low-income working Americans and more low-income working New Yorkers. But I think we overdid it. I think to the extent to which, and I think the left has helped us enthusiastically, making sure that there are no barriers to receiving those other assistance programs, no work requirements, no effort to get people more towards self-sufficiency and less relying on government benefit. And there are now work disincentives to those programs, whereby people will say, maybe I better not take that higher wage job, or maybe I better not work those extra hours because I'll lose these significant benefits. And I think that's a problem, and that has contributed in some respects, although it's not a phrase I like to use, sort of the culture of non-work, or the culture of that can negatively impact a community has come back. And I think the real challenge for the next president and for the next Congress is to find ways to bring work requirements into the food stamp program, to address the fraud issue in the ITC, bring work into disability programs. And the Child Support Enforcement Program has lost, it isn't any longer as much a positive impact on bringing dollars into single-parent families or enforcing the responsibility of non-present or absent parents. And when it comes to TANF, I do acknowledge that we have an issue at the very bottom. I think it's possible that there is, although the data is a little hard to see among severe poverty at the very bottom, but let's err on the side of caution. Let's worry about those families. And we don't have to change TANF really very much to do anything about it because we know where they are. Every social services program in the United States knows where those families are. They're on food stamps. They are single mothers who apply for food stamps, and when they apply and the caseworker says, well, what are your earnings? They say, I have no earnings. And then the caseworker says, okay, I'll budget you with the most food stamps I can give you, and doesn't bring up anything about work or engagement and sends them on their way. When I know as a social services commissioner, you can't live on food stamps alone. Right. There ought to be a sense in that program that we ought to address these households that are reporting no earnings. Now, there are a lot of things could be going on. They could have earnings, but it's off the books. They could have earnings and they just don't want to so that they can maximize their benefits. Or they could be, as some have said, people in real distress. Right. Either way, I think that the next Congress or the next president has got to bring some of the lessons of welfare reform to those other programs and focus through programs where we know where these households are on those at the very bottom. So I'll stop there.
Great. Our next speaker is Oren Cass, who is Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he focuses on energy, the environment, that's quite a lot, and anti-poverty policy. He was Domestic Policy Director of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, 2011-2012. Over to you.
Thank you. I guess I should say, as long as Mickey seems to get his tentacles somehow into everybody's past, I emailed you when I was a college sophomore.
And I was gracious, I'm sure.
You were. I had enrolled in my college's Poverty in America class, taught by the craziest, leftist-most professor in the department, and I thought of all the people I could ask, what should I read to at least get some sanity in my mind? I should ask Mickey Kaus. And so I emailed him and asked. And I don't remember exactly, but I think your response was along the lines of, yeah, that's going to be a long semester. Which proved true.
It's lucky I'm not a pastor. That would be a very bad reaction.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that's right.
But here I am, at least a few years later.
Right.
And, I think when I think about welfare reform, as we've talked about it today, it strikes me as something that it was certainly necessary, but it was nowhere near sufficient. And what I mean by that, and as we've heard from some of the statistics that have been thrown around, it's not clear that it really reversed any of the broader societal trends, particularly in the underclass, that were seen as its target. Poverty rates have stabilized, but it's not as if anyone is celebrating that we've won the war on poverty. And it didn't really address a lot of groups, especially men, younger men, who we're talking about now, at all. And there's a reason for that, which is that AFDC at the time and TANF now is a tiny, tiny fraction of the safety net. Robert just discussed some of those other programs, all of which are bigger than AFDC was or TANF is. But at this point, TANF is about 2% of the safety net. And so obviously fixing it wasn't going to fix all of our problems. But I also think it speaks to the size of the challenge that we still have. At this point, we spend about $20,000 on means-tested programs for every person in poverty, which means $60,000 more than median income for a single mother with 2 kids. And yet we're obviously not getting the kind of return on that money that we should expect. And it comes in a number of forms. Medicaid, by far the largest. A lot of times people almost ignore that as a safety net program, even though it's where virtually all the increases in spending have come in recent decades. Housing, food stamps, and so forth. And then also a variety of cash programs that remain around. The number of people whose states are now incentivized to push into SSI or SSDI means that the total number of people receiving cash assistance from the government isn't necessarily moving in the right direction at all. And then you have EITC, which has gone from a fairly small, interesting little tax credit to what I think a lot of people are kind of betting on to be the solution. And it wasn't designed to be that, and really is not structured to be that. So in general, I feel like where we are is that, in a sense, we won the battle, but we certainly didn't win the war. And we're probably losing the war in part on political grounds, which is that at this point, people think that the safety net has been shrunk and is being shredded. And you hear about 500,000 people coming off of food stamps, and that's pointed to as yet another example of support being taken away, even though there are 20 million more people on food stamps than there were when welfare reform passed. And so in that sense, we're really not moving in the right direction. And so for me, the question is not how do you redo welfare reform, but how do you go from welfare reform to welfare state reform? Because that's really what we're talking about that we're going to have to fix or at least make better. And I think there are two real opportunities there. One is in getting the money to its best uses. We're not going to dramatically increase anti-poverty spending anytime soon. We're probably not going to cut it anytime soon. But if we move the marginal dollar from a place where we're not getting a lot of value to a place where we are, we can do a huge amount of good at no actual cost. And my best estimate is there's probably at least $100 billion out there that you could move to significantly improve outcomes and the impact that you're having on low-income households at very little actual negative cost. And then the second thing I would say is that we have to figure out how to actually make work pay. We have a lot of programs that are supposedly supposed to be attached to work. I actually very much disagree with the view that more work requirements is the answer, because I really dislike the idea that housing or food stamps or Medicaid should be programs for people who work. People who work shouldn't need those programs. The safety net of government programs should be for people who don't work. And what that means is finding better ways to get cash support to people who do work. The EITC tries to do that. It doesn't do it especially well, and so I think either reforming the EITC or outright moving to a more direct subsidy that says if you're earning $7.50 an hour, you're getting $10.50 an hour in your paycheck, is a much more effective way to help low-income households, to make work more attractive than not work, and especially to provide that incentive that Mickey was talking about to get people into that first job, which in a sense is the most important incentive and change that we need to be focused on. And so I think that's a promising direction, and I think the upside is it may actually be politically possible. There will always be the budget fight over whether we should spend more or less. I don't think either side is going to win that anytime soon. I don't think the American people are especially interested in moving one way or the other anytime soon. Right. But there's no real reason for anyone on either side to be opposed to moving the dollar from a worse use to a better use, or at least opening up additional flexibility so that states or even individuals who see better uses for the money we're spending on them can actually put it in that direction.
Thank you. Finally, Reverend Eugene Rivers III is a widely published writer, community activist, worldwide speaker. He's worked on community development, faith-based initiatives, and domestic and foreign policy issues. I did some Wikipedia research. You were part of the fabled anti-gang initiative in Boston that met with considerable success. He's advised both Bush administrations and the Clinton administration on their faith-based initiatives and on foreign policy areas such as AIDS in Africa. Reverend Rivers.
I bring you greetings from the planet Earth. First, I want to sort of thank the Manhattan Institute because about 1995, 96, I began working with John J. DiIulio, who was then at Princeton. He was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And for, I guess, the next 10 years, we were engaged in an experiment to look at the role of faith-based institutions the role of faith-based institutions in solving problems. And the proposition was, how do we begin to examine how sacred institutions can serve secular purposes and solve problems? So that was the proposition. This was a non-sectarian deal to look at the churches, black churches in particular, uh, uh, and we had had success in Boston, where essentially faith-based activists adopted a street and drug gang in a particular area of Boston and used this experiment to evaluate the research. We began as a student group at Harvard, and a group of us as Christians. Dr. Jacqueline C. Rivers is here, who is my boss, AKA my wife, right? And a group of us moved into a neighborhood where 40% of the violent crime was being committed, and it represented 11% of the population. And so we went from Lawrence Mead to Sandy Jenks, from Moynihan to Cloward and Piven. And what we wanted to do, it was an intellectual exercise as much as it was a pastoral initiative. We wanted to sort of test the high theory on both sides of the line. And I recall being with Marian Wright Edelman at her farm in Tennessee. And the president signed the bill, and she insisted that this was the end of the world. And what was significant for us, as we were doing the work in Boston, where there were a number of drug gangs, and we began to focus, because another part of our thinking was informed by the Moynihan Report. Moynihan had stated the obvious, and I should point out parenthetically, was building his research and fundamental propositions on the academic research of black scholars, beginning with Webb Du Bois, 1896 Philadelphia Negro, which, and for you conservatives here, you want to hear a hard, no nonsense, make no excuses, black perspective on criminality, out of wedlock births. Read the final chapter of the Philadelphia Negro. W.E.B. Du Bois preaches, goes in. There are no excuses. You're going to get up off this stuff. The white man he's not quite an angel of mercy, true that. However, the black community must ultimately fix itself. It will not be the noblesse oblige of elite policy people who are essentially patronizing in one case or indifferent in the other, but there must be a focus on mobilizing these institutions. Now, remarkably, one of the most powerful statements that articulated that view, which is important for this discussion about how you move policy forward, is in an odd book. Christopher Jenks, from the left, wrote a book in 1976 entitled Haven in a Heartless World. It was the most notorious piece of ideological heresy that a leftist could write in 1976, where it was an articulate, brilliant defense. Lash, a brilliant defense of the nuclear family. And what is most fascinating in this discussion, and nobody reads Lash today, right, was his analysis of the Moynihan Report. He says the Moynihan Report has descriptively got most of the argument right. There's obviously a problem with the black community. All the criticisms of Moynihan were ridiculous. They were ridiculous. No, he wasn't a racist. And remarkably, all of his research is based on black scholars. And then he says, but Moynihan makes a mistake because he does not recognize, and this is where the black church comes in. He says that top-down approaches to addressing the issue of poverty by themselves must, in the nature of the case, left, right, and center fail. Because they do not have the capacity, and I love Ron Haskins' formulations this morning, right? Ultimately, this issue comes down to the black male. The instability is substantially exacerbated because no one wants to talk honestly about crime. Some of you saw that the New York Times ran a very interesting piece that get most of it wrong around the crime stuff, right? And in the New York Times, so they and what I want to propose is that the discussion around how we move forward in terms of poverty reduction policies must integrate into its discourse the premier sovereign institution of the communities to which you want to direct your intellectual interests. Part of the failure is that this was all doing stuff for poor people. You know, what the leftists have the cute term agency, right? And there was no assumption that these people had agency or capacity to fix themselves. There was this underlying, unstated ideological presupposition: we got to fix these people. They're a biological waste in the worst case scenario, or they're just generally pathetic and can't do anything about it. Therefore, we will fix them. The debate has to shift. Moving forward, since politically, you know, you got a choice between evil people and crazy people. I mean, that's, from the black community, as we watch this circus, right? You know, and it's a fascinating thing for us, right? We get dumped on so much, so it's so relaxing to sit back and watch white people go crazy, right? So it's just reassuring, right? I mean, you know, you're dumped on as a biological loser, and now you see white people lose their minds, right? So it's actually very entertaining, right? So I would like to have a discussion about how we address the black churches and other faith-based organizations to target very specifically in collaboration with the policy community. The brilliance and genius of John DiIulio is that DiIulio said, listen, we've got the issue of mass incarceration, we've got the issue of crime, which affect the political discourse surrounding these policy questions. How do we begin to integrate? You know, you've got 65,000 black churches that serve roughly 23 million black people. It is the one institution that's left, good, bad, ugly. It's the only institution left, and they must be incorporated into the discourse. It was a failure of patronizing high paleo liberals to just disregard these communities because blacks were pretty pathetic. We just needed to fix them, all right? So the conservatives, you know, and I want to applaud the Manhattan Institute because they led in terms of the national conversation years ago with John DiIulio and others to look at the role of faith-based institutions. On the issue of crime, mass incarceration, literacy, faith-based institutions are the only institutions that exist in your poorest neighborhoods that provide wraparound care 7 days a week. There is, in terms of research, Ram Kannan at the University of Pennsylvania did a book, The Other Philadelphia. And it's this amazing study where Kannan, you know, interviews 300 churches in West Philly and says, when you monetize the amount of services provided to the poorest communities in the most violent neighborhoods in West Philadelphia, right, it is absolutely astounding. But here again, this is underreported and part of the progressive left's idea that we would disregard those institutions, which are the only ones that are going to make a difference. Last point, because I'm bringing this thing home, right? I want people to consider, and I'm going to say this in as coded as a way as I can, the issue of black males and the fact that they're neglected, if not addressed in a serious way, and the good news is that it's correctable, we may have a national security issue on our hands that will make gangs be the good news. Now, the smart folk in this room will catch what I said. It's a deep thing. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Can I make one comment?
Yeah, so we're in the free-for-all section of our
First, one thing I want to say is, as a former practitioner in the social services world, the enormous extent to which I was dependent on the community-based organizations and faith-based institutions to help and to make a difference. Right. When I talk on these issues, I often talk about the big federal programs because that's what I know about and that's kind of the policy, but there isn't any doubt that that role is extremely important and has played an enormously positive impact. Secondly, I have to say about welfare reform that the best thing about it was that it said to people who had been treated as liabilities who couldn't do anything, right, no, you can, absolutely, and they proved it. Yeah, the real heroes of welfare reform aren't, you know, sorry, Ron, it's not you, or Bill Clinton or Newt Gingrich. It's the millions of young women who said, you know, if that's the rules of the game, I can do it and I will do it. Yeah. And their incomes, their work levels went up and their incomes went up. Their households became more stable. There wasn't, I don't think, any negative impact on the household. Their kids saw working people. Yeah. So I do feel that one of the good things about welfare reform was that it said, we believe you are capable, and they said, you know what, we are, and we can, and we will, and they did. And then, Orrin, for you, the blow up the whole system and send it out an employment subsidy idea it sounds really nice. Medicaid is by far the biggest. In New York City, it's $30 billion a year, federal, state, local, versus $2 for food stamps and less than $1 for TANF. And I'm not really sure when you say it's so easy politically that the country that has this enormous Medicaid program, all of those dollars go to providers and hospitals and nursing, are just going to convert that to a cash employment subsidy to people that will then be told, navigate your way through the insurance industry, find your own health care. I just think that's asking an awful lot of our institutions to change. And then on top of that, if you do it through an employment subsidy, everybody's going to get that. Anybody who works, my son, or a retired worker who decides to go to take a $8 an hour job, he'll get it too. And I don't know that that's going to put a clamp on our long-term federal debt problems. I don't know that that isn't going to lead to greater federal expenditure, not less.
Yeah, I think the Medicaid issue in particular is an instructive one, because if you look at why we spend so much money on Medicaid, what I would say at least is that it is not a function of any kind of rational decision about what we would like to spend money on. It's a function of every dollar a state puts toward Medicaid earns it multiple federal dollars, and a dollar put to something else does not. And so I think you're absolutely right. You can't simply say, all right, let's stop doing Medicaid and
Give everybody cash.
But to give just one concrete example of a place to start, I think if you told states, instead of saying you can apply for a Medicaid waiver as long as whatever you use with the money is equally focused on providing health care coverage, if you said you can apply for a Medicaid waiver and direct as much of it as you want to a health care program and as much of it as you want to an EITC expansion for your state's filers, I think, and you get the same amount of money no matter how you do it. You don't only get the match for Medicaid. That is kind of an opening bid, if you will. That's something that I think is absolutely politically plausible. Put some hard state choices to local and state communities. Some might say we're sticking with Medicaid, but I think if they were being rational and looking at how much of the Medicaid money they spend is already subjective expansions, right? There's a huge variation across states in what they even cover. So the idea that you can't scale that back isn't true. If you just said, let's scale it back to what the average state does, that's a huge change. So those are the pools of resources that I'm talking about that I think are not well spent today, that are politically viable to move around. And at the end of the day, the answer is not, and therefore we're throwing you into the individual insurance system instead. I mean, the reality is that low-income families that are not eligible for Medicaid don't go throw 50% of their resources toward finding health care coverage. Even middle-income families who are eligible for Obamacare subsidies, by and large, are not using them. It is not the right use of money for the low-income household trying to figure out how to allocate their resources. And the only reason we put the money there is because of the way we designed Medicaid as an entitlement, and then told states we will give you massive cash bonuses if it's what you focus on. So I agree we're not going to blow up the entire welfare state tomorrow, but I think if we know where we want to go and what some of the problems are, there are some pretty meaningful reforms we could pursue.
What about the public jobs component? I think that's something that got lost. It was done in Wisconsin. You did it in New York. Not many other jurisdictions copied it. It's something that would provide, ideally, you would provide a job for the men. So you wouldn't just have a handle on the women. You'd offer something to the men. It would connect them to the world of work. I don't see any. It's a idea that both left and right, I think, can agree with. And we shouldn't rely on the states to do it because they haven't done it. They've had 20 years, they haven't done it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I've always been a supporter of it as a last resort, offering people jobs. And I also think there are a lot of jobs that need to get done. The example in New York is that we had both a work experience program, which was like Workfare, where you worked off your grant, And we also had a Parks Opportunity Program where you actually got a wage, you actually became a member of the union, you got benefits, and the job was a little better. It was also temporary, 6 to 9 months, but it was a job. And it turned out that the city of New York depended on those jobs to make the parks work successfully for the broader citizenry. So I've always had a little bit of a problem with the classic conservative answer that, oh, it's, make work jobs is a bad idea. So I've been generally positive about that. I don't know quite about federal state. I am a state guy, and the program that I thought was the most problematic that I watched every day was SSI and SSDI, and that is a federal program. You go into a federal office, you see a federal worker, you get a federal check, and I don't think that works very well. And I would much rather give the authority into states and communities and hold them accountable for results than run something out of Washington.
Mickey, one of the things I'd like to put on the table, we're talking about public works, jobs, programs. In the inner city, if there's, as most folk will know, enormous amounts of talent. They're undereducated, but they're smart as hell. They're just very brilliant, articulate young guys. One of the things that needs to be put on the table as we talk about labor is the idea of wealth creation. There are, and I would think that at the Manhattan Institute, if any place, right, the idea of wealth creation and business would be something that would provide an incentive. You would incentivize legal economic activity. See, there's a whole class of young men, they're going to make money one way or the other. Now, frankly, if they were demographically a different crowd, they'd be applauded as geniuses. That not being the case, they are simply criminals, right? And this idea, because we've had a number of conversations in our work in the inner city where I grab a bunch of brothers, bring them to, and these are criminals. These dudes are certified. These are certified criminals. And I say, okay, look, this is going to be an informal kind of a re-entry program. Let's figure out what we can do with these young men. And every single one of them wanted to learn about a business and wanted to make the transition from being a drug dealer. They understood they had a short shelf life. They were entrepreneurs. These are creative individuals, right? Now, how can we begin, moving forward, to develop the kinds of programs that focus on wealth creation, which is one of the things that's celebrated in this country probably more than anything else? How do we get that conversation going? Because for many of the young men, they're not stupid and they're realists. They see that the fix is in at one level. Now, you hold out the promise that there is opportunity, and these are not young men looking for welfare, public assistance. They want to work. How do we create a context? Because here is a way substantially. Just quick example on this. Hip hop. Most of you don't know much about the history of hip hop. It is a multi-billion-dollar business. For some of you, with much regret, it is a multi-million-dollar business, which was created based on, the ingenuity, the innovativeness of individuals who in a different context would have, here again, been celebrated as geniuses. How does the private sector become a player? So we're not talking simply about public assistance. We're talking about incentivizing innovation. Sort of an inner city kind of Silicon Valley thing, looking at any number of industries where these individuals actually have the capacity to be productive. How does that happen? Or how can we make that? That's my question.
I want to close this part on a sour note, which is there are a bunch of trends that are negative that we have to deal with. One is automation, most obviously.
Right.
A lot of unskilled jobs, and even the White House is worried about this. They put out a position paper that 83% of people making less than $20,000 are going to find themselves losing their jobs due to automation. It was not clear whether they would find another job, but automation is a big threat to unskilled workers, and those are the types of jobs that we want people to start at. The second issue is immigration, obviously. More immigration probably increases the supply of workers competing. I know in your paper you suggested we regulate it. And the third, and I'm worried that I can see it coming down the pike, is the push by the left for a guaranteed income. They're basically going to say, we're losing our jobs to the robots, we're not going to get a job anyway, immigrants are doing the jobs we used to do. It's much simpler just to put everybody on the dole. And I can even see Paul Ryan's plan turning into that. Paul Ryan has a plan which is similar to yours, maybe it is yours. And you send the funds to the states, and the only two work requirements that I've seen he has are actively looking for work, which is the bogus work requirement in unemployment insurance, which everybody knows how to game, or work-related activities, which I think is what Ron Haskins used to call underwater basket weaving, which is basically any sort of thing vaguely, self-esteem classes vaguely related to work. And if you put those two very lightweight work requirements together with putting a whole lot of people, aiding them with this Paul Ryan fund, you wind up with something that's pretty close to a guaranteed income. Why is that a crazy worry?
Well, if I can jump in on that, and I think this goes to the other skepticism you raised about the states generally, which is that if you give a huge pool of money to the states, you're not dictating that there be a basic income. By saying there are no work requirements, you're essentially just saying Washington, D.C. is probably not the best decider of the correct structure, at least to the degree that we should confidently impose it universally. And so I think one possible outcome of taking away a lot of the restrictions, encouraging states to go different directions, is that a few might pursue a basic income. I wouldn't encourage them to, but if you have a bunch of different states and a couple of them do a basic income, we'll find out whether it works or not. If you leave everything in Washington and say any policy reform must be one that can be rolled out through the federal departments, jammed down simultaneously onto all states with their different political systems and preferences, you're essentially throwing up your hands and saying, well, forget it, we're never going to get any reform. If you disaggregate it, you are not going to like all the reforms you get, but nobody is going to like all of the reforms they get. And everyone is going to like some of the reforms they get. And that's a much better model for moving things forward, I would say, than simply leaving the stakes as anyone who can ram something through Congress wins, and until then we won't do anything.
But Mickey, in view of what you said, what's the alternative if not that?
I don't know. My alternative, and there's a dystopian novel about this by Kurt Vonnegut called Player Piano. My alternative is a WPA guaranteed job. Okay. And in Vonnegut's novel, this devolves into a program just to keep people busy called The Reeks and the Wrecks. If you read it, it's a pretty depressing novel. But that's the only thing I've come up with. But I don't claim to have a solution.
I think in the Ryan proposal, and again, it was a discussion proposal where he was looking for lots of feedback, there was an emphasis on work requirements, that states would get the block grant, they then could do what they want, and they could administer it through different vehicles. But there was, I'm not so sure that he walked away from the work requirement. I do agree that this universal benefit issue is now reemerging, and I think it's very problematic and would take us backwards. And the last thing on automation, what I look at when I see the data is a barbell thing, where the jobs are at the lower end, which are the entry-level jobs, aren't really going away, at least not yet. They've grown. And then the high-wage and high-skill jobs are there. But there's been this sort of exposure of people, and now we're getting into, we may even mention that awful person's name here in a minute. There's an exposure of the people in the middle, the lower middle class, angry white crowd that's lost their income and who apparently are supporting Mr. Trump. And what I really worry about is that we will welfareize that. And that, I think, is just the wrong, first of all, we can't afford it. And I don't know why we don't send the same messages to them that we sent to people in the community when we changed welfare.
Yeah.
There's self-reliance and there's self-responsibility, and we need you to step up. We can't just rush in with another transfer program to restore your income to $50,000.
Okay, let's open it up. I see Larry Mead first, and then this gentleman over here.
I certainly agree that to go over to a guaranteed income would be a big mistake. That would take us back to the kind of thinking that liberal economists went through in the late 60s and 70s, and which we turned away from, fortunately, in the 80s and 90s. But if you don't do that, then you have to address this fear that there will be no jobs. And I think that does involve some kind of work guarantee. Now, this issue came up in the AEI Brookings report, and we debated it. And actually, I want to contend that it's actually not a very big issue. In the localities where work was guaranteed, including Wisconsin and New York City, it was really only in New York City that you had a large-scale workfare program, where the thing was something like 25, 35,000 slots at its height. But in general, what workfare actually does is not create a vast structure of public jobs alongside the private economy. That's what conservatives fear. That's not what really happened. What happened in WEP was the provision of a workfare job actually drove most people off welfare. They then went to the private sector and got jobs there. So the effect of a public job is actually not to create a parallel economy, but to enforce the work test more effectively in the private sector. That's what actually happens. The other thing is when you say a work guarantee, it's not entirely clear what that means. It doesn't mean necessarily that you have a vast structure of public jobs. It could mean rather that you place people repeatedly in the private sector until they get a job that they can keep. That's what America Works does. This is a very famous employment program, much patronized by the Manhattan Institute, which I support. They basically place people in the private sector, and if they don't keep that job, they place them again and again until they finally catch on. So the work guarantee doesn't necessarily mean a public job. It can also mean an effective placement operation in the private sector. So unless we really believe there's going to be a total breakdown of the private economy, we're not producing a governmental economy here. What we're actually doing is a guarantee, and the actual form that that takes is going to depend on local conditions. It's not a reason either to go over to a guaranteed income or to abandon the work test is impractical.
This gentleman and
our guest from Dallas spoke about Afro-American males having a hustle,
Right,
which he didn't define.
right.
Our other faith-based leaders spoke about the entrepreneurial spirit of Afro-Americans in ghetto communities.
Right.
Is there a possibility of government providing some seed money or support to get these hustles going so it leads to a full-time job? In other words, can we target monies to these people already earning, surviving, just so that they can get started, so they can have a permanent job?
Yeah, see, the question that I'm sort of concerned with, pivoting off the bishop and the pastor, is if we really believe in self-reliance and individual initiative, if that's our line, then we need to invest in it. See, we can't suck on both ends of the straw. We have venture capital folk who invest and help jumpstart all kinds of things, a significant percentage of which fail. I mean, and some of you folks put big money into projects that go up in smoke every day. Some nitwit with some goofy idea comes. He or she is connected to somebody who went to somebody's prep school, and it's all one of those kind of deals. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? They went to Horace Manor Collegiate and met in the country club, and the kid wanted to start something in Silicon Valley, didn't have a clue what he was doing, right? But he had the right pedigree in the name, and he got funded. There is all kinds of brilliance in these inner cities, and if we believe in private enterprise and initiative, there can be some way which is controlled and monitored, where you give these young people a reason to believe that they have a stake in a system that rewards all kinds of wealth that I'm not going to talk about because this is the wrong crowd, right? So how do we do that? How do we create incentives? If we're talking about business, young men and women who are hustlers, who understand the game, and in their lives, and see, this is the thing we have to ward against. We have to work against the growing nihilism for a generation that say, the fix is in, I ain't mad, I'm just going to play it. Now, this can have deleterious effects for the broader society, you know. So how do we begin to have an adult conversation about how we bring these opportunities to young people if we're serious about this? And here again, we're not talking about charity, we're not talking about welfare, we're talking about folk investing in initiatives that bring a return. So you get the image of the black guy, we get away from the narrative and the image of the black guy as some pathetic supplicant, right, who's always begging for a handout. James Brown said, I don't want a handout, I just want a hand up, right? Not looking for that. How do we have that adult conversation?
I would also just like to point out that the face of poverty in New York or around the country is not all black.
Right.
I mean, there's some struggling white people and Hispanic
Oh,
people
absolutely.
and immigrants.
I've been watching
and
for the last 10 weeks.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And I just and you know, and sometimes in these environs it becomes all about African Americans, and it really isn't. I mean, the non-marital birth rate has risen dramatically among whites. More white children are born to non-married mothers than black children every year. So right. I got your question, and I agree with your answer.
Right.
But it's about a broader community than just one color.
Okay, so let me say something about that. I agree with that. I completely agree with that. It needs to be a big tent, group hug, everybody there, it's mad love. Right? I get all that, right? I get all that, right? Okay. However, that said, we have some pockets and concentrations of poverty, y'all. You're going to pray on the front end or you're going to pray on the back end, because things are getting worse. It's a bad thing when Chicago is Chirac, and that's not a joke. So all I'm saying, so listen, I'm for Joe Sixpack and Martha. I want them happy.
Well,
I want the white
I
folk
just,
taken care of.
you know, but I
Lord
see your
knows,
point.
right? Because when they get mad, they're a dangerous crowd. So I don't, Lord Jesus, we got to take care of them, right?
Okay. Yes, but you go.
I got to take care of Bubba.
I think this is excellent. Something that Paul Ryan and Bob Woodson and Omar, myself, and a couple others, the generals are already out there. The answer is there. We're not funding it. We want to talk about the problem and not the solution. If we focused on the solution, whether it's a black neighborhood or Hispanic neighborhood or a Caucasian neighborhood, doesn't matter. You have nonprofit, faith-based programs that are committed to changing lives, changing minds, changing attitudes. We're spending the money in the wrong places. It's like trying to go to Giant to buy shoes. You can't. You know, you go there to buy food. But if you go to the wrong place looking for the wrong thing, you just waste time. So somewhere we have to stop the clock. And we have to reset time. And once we decide to do that as a people, not as black people, not as white people, not as rich people, not as poor people, and understand until we do that, we all lose. And if we want to change that, it just simply means transitioning the money to where the answer is. And the answer is already there. It's in the states. It's in the cities. It's in the communities.
I completely agree with that, and just to give you a little background, my family came to Brooklyn because my father was asked to work in an anti-poverty program.
Can I tell
No, you can't. Not yet. Not at all. Okay.
Gotcha.
And in Restoration in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And it was a community-based organization, and it got funding, and I'm all for that. But while they were trying to turn that neighborhood around, the larger welfare system got more and more about an entitlement without a work requirement and not interested in family. So no matter how hard you worked in the community-based organization, if we don't change the larger federal message, you're going to be undermined by your own country.
Absolutely.
And so I want to do both. That's all I'm saying.
That's what we feel.
And let me pick up on your point. See, the secret, the news flash is these young black men want to work. They want the hustlers are basically workers. They're just illegal. I mean, it's not that they don't work. They'll give you a 90-hour week, right? But what they're doing is illegal. We have got to create a context where innovative, creative, hardworking, make no excuses individuals are invested in so they can produce a return for the larger society. And your point, I'm all for moving away from the entitlement mentality. across the board. And the overwhelming majority of black churches don't believe in it. They're on some responsibility, conversion, decisions, destiny, do your job, don't be a slacker, and drop the excuses. The black church is a no excuse proposition.
One or two more questions. Oh, way in the back there. You had your hand up before. Yeah.
A lot of talk among you gentlemen about tweaking this program or tweaking that program or redirecting somewhere else. But isn't it the fact that the fundamental point of all of the anti-poverty efforts, and particularly the federal anti-poverty efforts, is to make absolutely 100% sure that nobody ever gets out of poverty so that the funding can be maintained and the programs can be grown. And you can tweak them this way and you can tweak them that way. And it always comes out the same. When the war on poverty started, there was 14% of the people in poverty. The spending was minimal. Today, the spending is $1 trillion a year. The poverty rate is 14%. The population has doubled, so the number of people in poverty has doubled. And you could tweak this and you could tweak that, but the bureaucrats are going to beat you because they want their jobs and their funding and their promotions, and it is critically important to them that the black men remain supplicants.
That's absolutely true. No, listen, let me just say this. No conspiracy. Go ahead.
Well,
I want to hit that. So go ahead.
all right, you can then hit me too. I think the answer I would give is yes and no. The no is that I think it's really incorrect to attribute those motives to the people working in those agencies and on those programs, both generally and with respect to a particular racial group. I think the people who dedicate themselves to this kind of work, by and large, could be making more money elsewhere, among other things. And some of them. Certainly at the higher levels who are trying to get a hold of it. And that I think is both wrong and not constructive to come in with an approach that this is the point of anti-poverty policy, to keep people poor. That being said, I think the element of truth in it is that the structure, and this is why we're back to be talking about tweaking structures, incentives count for the federal bureaucracy just like they count for the inner city household. And the incentive structure of the federal bureaucracy is a set of siloed programs in different agencies with different legislation, each of whom wants to be as big as important and as important as possible. And so it's a system that resists reform, and it's a system that actively encourages efforts to expand eligibility and get more money in. So while you don't have to attribute ill will to any of those people, I think it is important to ask who in this system is actually looking for ways to shrink these programs over time. Who is there to say, gosh, it would be really great if we weren't spending so much on Medicaid 10 years from now. And there's no one in the system who is incentivized or rewarded to do that. And so as we design and reform programs, asking how to make the incentives work for government and the bureaucrats, I think, is just as important as figuring out how to make it work for the recipients of the aid.
And I would just say that properly measured, the poverty line, is there has been progress, especially when looked at material well-being. So people are in, I think, better material condition than they were or would have been if we hadn't changed the programs. And there is more work. But wages have remained low, and the government has decided, Democrats and Republicans, that it's a good thing to shore up low wages with some income transfers that keep people receiving some benefit while they work as well. And then finally, I cannot emphasize enough that every time you use the $800 trillion or whatever number you use to describe how the growth of the welfare state has happened in the United States, it's all in Medicaid. It's all going to hospitals and doctors and healthcare providers. So the bureaucrats you're talking about aren't really social services workers. They are the industrial medical world.
Good point. Thank you.
Last question. Sir.
Sorry. There hasn't been much discussion, there was a little bit of discussion, but not a whole lot about, what do we really want in the way of a temporary safety net versus what do we want in the form of a support mechanism for folks that really can't do for themselves. It's one thing to say, you've got mentally disabled, or you've got a senior citizen, and we're going to give them permanent housing because they can't care for themselves. It's another thing to say we're going to give permanent housing or other benefits to folks that are able-bodied. And I'd like the panel to address how the future of all of these, not just welfare, but all of these support mechanisms ought to take that into account.
I'll say something.
You go first, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to conceptualize this issue is to compare what are we absolutely committed as a society to providing everybody, no matter how legitimate or illegitimate their claim is, versus what can people earn on their own. And at this point, the kind of basic medical care, politically, whether or not you believe it morally, that we are going to be providing to everybody amounts to thousands of dollars a year. Deinstitutionalization debates aside, the fact that we're essentially committed to providing shelter to everybody is going to cost money every year. The fact that we are not going to let anybody starve costs money every year. And now the things that are still debated are questions like, is everyone entitled to a cell phone and broadband internet access, right? That's the direction the discussion's actually gone. And the problem is that when you add all that up, it costs more than a minimum wage job. That's just the two numbers. And so how do you design a system in a world where what we're going to give everybody probably does look at least as good as a minimum wage job in some respects? And in my view, the answer to that has to be, even if the value of those might look the same, how do you make the minimum wage job a more attractive place to start? Because it's the first step up. And you can do that by helping make the minimum wage job pay more. You can also do it just by making sure that for people who are actually trying to work, they get support in the form of cash. And that's the distinction, that we do have a safety net that we're going to provide to everyone, whether you like it or not, but it might come through government programs that aren't all that great. And if you're actually working, any support we provide to you is going to be in the form you want it, which is the money in your paycheck. And I think starting to just think about those two numbers and recognizing the reality of where they are and where they're going to go over time, given our labor market and the cost of living, has to be the starting point for how you design the system.
Yeah, I would only add that I think the way you get to temporary is a strong work test, a work expectation of people receiving assistance, and you help. And then the other thing is we've talked all about these public assistance programs. We haven't talked about schools or family, and longer term we need to do a better job in schools, and we need to promote stronger families and community-based organizations. That will produce the human capital that is going to be less dependent on assistance to shore up low wages.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks for the Manhattan Institute.
All right, we're going to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just wanted to wrap things up by thanking the moderators and the panelists. I think we had a very stimulating and enlightening conversation today, and I want to thank all of you again for coming, and the Manhattan Institute for making this forum possible. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, our policy debates about helping the disadvantaged often focus on intentions instead of results. It's not very often that our politicians and policymakers stop and ask whether the policies themselves are contributing to the problem, and that's for a variety of reasons that we touched on even in this final panel about the incentives being put in place for the so-called poverty industry itself. But it extends to areas outside of welfare per se. Will rent control increase or decrease the supply of affordable housing? Will hiking the minimum wage increase the number of jobs at a higher rate? Or will it decrease the number of jobs overall? And what's the more desirable outcome? The history of poverty policies that we've been discussing today, how welfare programs impact work incentives and so forth, is no different. In 1959, 32% of heads of poor families worked full-time. By 1989, the percentage had fallen to 16%. In 1959, 31% of heads of poor families did not work at all. By 1989, that percentage had climbed to more than 50%. Did the rapid expansion of welfare programs have anything to do with that? 20 years after Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, Harvard's Nathan Glazer looked back and offered this assessment. He said that in our social policies, we are trying to deal with the breakdown of traditional ways of handling distress. These traditional ways are located in the family primarily, but also in the ethnic group, the neighborhood, the church. Glazer said that in our efforts to deal with the breakdown of these traditional structures, our social policies are weakening them further and making matters, in some important respects, worse. In New York City in 1925, 5 out of 6 young black kids lived with both parents, and just 3% of black families were headed by a woman under 30. Going back more than 100 years, when blacks were just one generation out of slavery, data show black marriage rates slightly higher than white marriage rates. And that would remain true in every census taken between 1890 and 1940. In 1940, the black illegitimacy rate was 19%. But in the 1960s, welfare programs began growing dramatically, and so did the black out-of-wedlock birth rate. By 1975, black illegitimacy rate was nearly 50%. By 2000, it was pushing 70%. One study concluded that a 50% increase in welfare benefits led to a 43% increase in the number of out-of-wedlock births. We spend a lot of time discussing which anti-poverty programs worked best, but here's a statistic to keep in mind. The percentage of black married households in poverty is in the single digits. That was true before welfare reform, and it's true today. The tremendous progress made by blacks prior to the rapid expansion of the welfare state in the 1960s is regularly ignored or downplayed. But the fact of the matter is that the percentage of black families living in poverty was 87% in 1940. And over the next 20 years, it fell by 40 percentage points to 47% in 1960. That's prior to the war on poverty. In the first half of the 20th century, blacks also increased their years of education, of schooling, and of entry into white-collar professions at unprecedented rates that would never be matched again, not even under affirmative action, not even under black senators and governors and mayors, or even a black president. Between 1950 and 1960, here in New York City, the number of black accountants increased by 220%. The number of engineers grew by 134%. The number of teachers grew by 125%. Physicians and lawyers grew by more than 50%. All this occurred prior to the Great Society, prior to racial preferences. What's really remarkable about the recent black history is the stunting of this progress, and in some cases, retrogression that occurred in the wake of the 1960s. Yet policymakers have little interest in exploring whether Great Society-era programs designed to help certain racial and ethnic groups have in practice been a hindrance to that progress. Going forward, I hope this history can at least become part of the conversation. Thank you all for coming today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.